as a prelude to looking at some social political philosophy in more detail, I wanted to go over some general social political kind of issues and categories. And you can use this as a way to kind of gauge some of the philosophers that we'll talk about, and also just in general, people's social political perspectives. Now, some of this stuff might be fairly old hat. It's basic stuff that you may have heard many times before. On the other hand, some of it might be new to you. I want to start with a concept or an issue that's more new, and that is the nature, what human beings are like naturally. And this is an issue that the philosopher Thomas Hobbes famously put at center stage in the late 1500s, early 1600s. And he raised an issue of what the state of nature was like for human beings. And the state of nature sort of combines two ideas. One is, what are people like without any interference from like any sort of government or hierarchical structure? Like if you imagine a situation where there's no government, there's no hierarchy, it's just everyone just does whatever they want, basically anarchy. You can think of this as some past, sort of caveman days or whatever, or and if that's not realistic, although Hobbes thought it was, you can think of it in terms of like, what would things be like if in a zombie movie, right, where the zombies are going crazy and the government breaks down completely, and that's sort of according to a thinker like Hobbes, that reveals something about human nature. And what he thinks it would reveal is that we'd obviously be basically self-interested creatures, and we'd be sort of brutally committed to our own self-interest, to the extent that it interferes with the self-interest of everyone else around us. We wouldn't care about them at all. We would do whatever we needed to do to get by, completely to the detriment of anyone around us. So that the state of nature for Hobbes would be what he says it would be a state of war. Everyone would be sort of at each other's throats, competing for resources, and it would be like the most horrible situation you can imagine. Now, we can think of that. That's sort of like one extreme in effect, and we can think of this as a spectrum. On the other end of the scale is often placed the later French, Belgian-born philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who comes into the conversation a few hundred years after Hobbes, and he directly addresses Hobbes' view of the state of nature, and he thinks almost completely the opposite. He thinks that our natural state, the way we are naturally, is we're pretty noble, self-sufficient sort of beings, with a lot of integrity, if not exactly a sense of morality. And he thinks that it's actually society that corrupts us. So whereas Hobbes thinks we're naturally pretty nasty creatures, and corrupt and self-interested, and will do anything to others, sort of cutthroat, and then society does the job of sort of re-educating us or changing our essential nature by influencing us to behave better. Rousseau actually thought that we're naturally more noble than we are within sort of organized society. So he thinks that organized society actually corrupts us and makes us into these sort of selfish, vain creatures that Hobbes said we were naturally. So it's almost like an inversion of Hobbes' idea. So that you could think of these two as constituting like each end of the spectrum. And you have various philosophers who have views that are in between the two. One example that we're going to look at is John Locke. And Locke you could think of as being somewhere in between Hobbes and Rousseau in a way. Locke thinks that our nature is that we are reasonable creatures. So it's not so much that we're great and we're noble and we have a lot of integrity naturally, like Rousseau thinks, but society turns us into these corrupt beings. And at the same time, it's not exactly like Hobbes thinks that we're naturally selfish and brutal, and society is the only thing keeping us from tearing each other apart. It's somewhere in I think saying we're naturally reasonable creatures is somewhere in between. And we may have seen earlier with Aristotle that was there's something in common with his view there. So one question is what human beings are like in the state of nature, or what we're like naturally, and then how society kind of interacts with that, influences us in different sorts of ways. Another kind of key political issue or issue of social political philosophy has to do with political power structures. And of course there are various power structures that have existed throughout history. The one that we're most familiar with today, democracy, essentially means you have majority control. Now, it seems like if majority control is one option, then the other option would be minority control. And sometimes the term oligarchy is used in a more specific way, but here I want to use the word oligarchy to mean in general that you have minority control of over society. So some minority makes the rules, sets the policies, versus the majority making the rules and setting the policies. Now you could have various different kinds of minorities that are in charge. The most familiar from history is monarchy or aristocracy, where being in charge is determined by heredity, right? It's, if the king's son becomes the next king, the king's brother is the, I don't know, duke or earl or something like that, or whatever. And so that's the most familiar system throughout history. It's a little bit, it's strange to think how that could have come about. Here are some other examples. You could have a plutocracy where those with money make the rules, and you could have a military system where those who hold the guns make the rules, or a theocracy where you have leadership by religious leaders are also the political leaders. And one can imagine that the hereditary system may have somehow evolved from these other systems where something that seems more naturally influential is the reason why people are able to make the rules. Another issue that I might bring up here is the issue of, we can make a distinction between official and being officially or being unofficially one of these sort of systems. So there are, democracy is kind of, everyone in today's world sort of views democracy as, an advantageous system. It's usually praised. And there's, in many countries, there's question about whether, they say they're officially democratic, but there's a question of whether what goes on behind the scenes. We are told that Russia, although officially democratic, is actually some kind of oligarchy. We're told that the same is true in Cuba and some other places. Recently, some authors did a study, and they argued that actually our own system in the United States is officially democratic, but the results, they argued, are not so democratic. The two statisticians, one from Princeton, the other from Northwestern, in 2014, did a study where they did some polling and tried to figure out what the majority wanted on a number of issues, and then they found that wasn't what the government executed, and they did this over the course of 10 years. And so an argument was made that actually we're not as democratic as we thought, and that's not through some kind of fake elections or anything like that. That's just the elections can be real, but then the politicians get into office, and maybe they do what they're told to do, or by people who donate to their campaigns or something like that. So it's a result of corruption. Now, there have been some studies that have criticized that and argued that, that argument that we're not so undemocratic as those authors had originally claimed. So there's back and forth on that regarding our own society. But certainly the corruption issue is, almost everyone would agree that the corruption is a major problem. It's a chink in the sort of armor of democracy. If you ask a person from most democratic countries, like what is the most corrupt government on earth, they'll say mine, right? Like you ask an Italian, an Irish person, you ask an American, like what's the most corrupt government? Each one is going to say it's mine, and many other places too. So I mean, this might lead us to question whether there's any other options. It sort of seems like, well, either the minorities in control, or either the minorities in control or the majorities in control. Are there any other options as yet explored? Famously, Winston Churchill said, "Democracy is a terrible system, but it's the only, but it's just better than everything else anyone's ever thought of, but it's terrible, right?" So, I mean, here are a couple ideas. A friend of mine who's an engineer had this idea, and I thought it was interesting. I'll just bring it up. What about a majority system, but what the majority wants is not determined by having them vote for leaders. Instead, what the majority wants is determined by a random sample. So maybe you take a random sampling of people and you put them in charge, rather than having everyone vote for leaders who then make the decisions. You literally take people who are not professional politicians, put them in charge for a short time, 2 years, 4 years, whatever. Have a lot of them so that it can be a representative sample of people in the country, and they know, and they don't get to be politicians for life, right? They know they're going to go back to their ordinary life. So when they if they're inclined to make decisions that benefit them, well, then it would be a decision that benefits, a random sampling of the population anyway. So that's, an idea that's, I don't know if that's ever been tried, like a random sample government. Another idea that I had, and this is something maybe that you might find a little an alarming idea, but what if the government is neither a majority of people nor a minority of people, because the government isn't humans at all, and I don't have in mind aliens here, but we're currently making like vast improvements in artificial intelligence, and is it possible that we could put the job of governing sometime in this would be way in the future, obviously, in the hands of like artificial intelligence, either one like computer or multiple computers, or robots or whatever, who would then be programmed. We'd put in whatever we wanted, whatever society we wanted to live in. We'd put in certain desires that we have, like we want as many people as possible to have food and shelter and clothing and live a decent life. So tell us what the rules would be, and you have like this artificial intelligence like work it out. They've already got artificial intelligences that are capable of learning things without just doing whatever the program outputs. There's a chess computer made by Google that they didn't teach it. They didn't tell it. They didn't give it rules for chess playing. Instead, they told it to figure out the rules itself. Now, I don't know the details of that, but that suggests if you go further with this, you could have these super intelligent computers capable of learning and planning, and they would also be less corruptible than human beings. So, I mean, maybe it's not like some kind of sci-fi nightmare to have like artificial intelligence in charge. Maybe that could be a good thing. Just a thought. And we're used to thinking of the system we live in America as democratic. This quote from Thomas Jefferson might then surprise you. I'll just give you a second to look at it. And so he has negative things to say about democracy there, that it's mob rule. 1%, 51% can oppress the other 49%. And this is actually a confusion in terminology, because we use the term democracy today to refer to these sort of modified systems of democracy that people like Jefferson and Madison and other American founders came up with. But at their time, they used the word democracy to refer to the ancient Greek system, which was direct democracy. And that's where individual decisions about policies, specific policies, were made by majority vote. So, an example was what to do with some gold that they found. There's a famous case where the Athenians found a bunch of gold and they had a vote, like, what should we do with it? Buy a navy or some other thing. And they chose to buy a navy. Now, the problem with that kind of democracy, according to the American founders, well, this was one problem, that, they shouldn't be able to take away the rights of the other 49, because they believe there were certain rights that it doesn't matter what the majority thinks. And another problem was that it tended to be chaotic. There tended to be like a swaying, like back and forth between extremes when you just put everything to a majority vote. So they came up with a system of what we today would still call democracy, although they didn't use that word, with sort of checks on it. One check was that, unlike the ancient Greeks, we have a representative democracy. That means that rather than vote on individual decisions, for the most part, although there are referendums, we vote on representatives who go and make policy decisions on our behalf. So the idea being, you vote for someone who you think is qualified to make a decision, rather than voting for the decision itself. And other checks that were placed on democracy were what you might call sort of fixed points, right? We have certain rights that are enshrined in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that it doesn't matter if the majority doesn't, if the majority of people wanted to limit freedom of speech, that's too bad, because the Constitution says that everyone has this right to freedom of speech. So even if like 90% of people, decided you shouldn't be able to speak out against, let's say, Christianity, right? Because it was the most popular religion. It wouldn't matter, right? That would be it's in the Constitution, so it doesn't matter if most people are don't want to limit freedom of speech in that case. And we have like appointed judges who interpret the law, and they're not voted for by the majority. They're appointed by leaders, who the leaders are voted for by the majority. So that ties in with the representation issue. So the notion of rule of law comes in as another kind of alternative to democracy here that I didn't mention before. I brought up the artificial intelligence idea, but this is another alternative. The idea that these laws, the founders came up with these laws, and they're for the most part unchangeable, so that we're not so much governed by people, whether a minority or whether a majority, so much as being governed by laws. There are rules, and there has to be consistency, at least supposedly, in how those laws are applied, so that it's not like a situation where you have a king who can decide one day he wants the rule to be one thing, and the next day he just changes his mind and wants it to be something else. So this is another way of doing sort of a modification on democracy that's maybe an alternative in a way. Now, a third spectrum on which we can sort of gauge someone's social political ideas is what they think about economics. And here we can also sort of think in terms of a couple of kind of extreme ends of a spectrum. And on the one hand, we have socialism. On the other hand, what's called sometimes laissez-faire capitalism. If you're not familiar with that term, it sort of means that the government completely avoids any kind of, keeps its hands off the economic system. And the economic system meaning, business. This socialism is difficult to define. There are various ways of looking at it, but sort of the most agreed upon definition is the idea that the means of production should be owned publicly. so that the people doing the work, that is, the majority, the public in general, have control over like what gets produced. The means of production means like factories and even tools and things like that are used to produce more wealth, more products for whoever it is as a whole. And of course, in capitalism, the means of production is owned privately. Whoever happens to own the factory, they hire people to work in it, and they can try to pay them as little as they can. And there's kind of there's negotiations that go on between the factory owner and the workers, and the factory owner is totally in charge of what gets produced, and determines that by what they think they can make like the most profit on. Just to further kind of specify how far apart these options are here, for someone like Adam Smith, the 1700s capitalist economist, the government should refrain from making any economic decisions at all, and leave everything up to the free market. The idea that you let business owners, factory owners produce whatever they think they can make a profit on, let workers try to get as much money as they can for their labor, and let people buy things for as cheap as they can, and let people act basically for their own self-interest. Let people behave greedily, and actually, Smith thinks if everybody does that, it will actually work out for the best, because in the ensuing kind of set of negotiations, according to Smith, he's famous for saying it will be as if an invisible hand was like lifting up the majority by the actions of self-interested, selfish minorities. So like this sort of greedy behavior on the part of different individuals will actually lead to everyone as a whole rising up. On the other hand, the socialist view is extreme opposite to that. That the idea that the government or some kind of representation, someone like Marx or a Marxist might say, it's not necessarily the government, but it's the workers in some sort of form or another. And then the question there is like, well, how are the workers determining this? If they're voting, then it seems like it's some kind of a government. Well, in any case, there's sort of, we'll get into that whole debate later. But the government essentially makes economic decisions, and they, in some cases makes all the economic decisions. They distribute the goods and services, determine who gets what. They set the regulations and protocol. And they also determine what gets produced, so that this is determined on behalf of the public somehow by a government, whether it's democratic, whether it's some other kind of government. That's a separate issue, of course, from the economic issue about how things get produced and then who they go to. Of course, let's not forget that hybrids and sort of various places on the spectrum are occupied between, complete socialism and complete laissez-faire capitalism. We live in a society the government does set some regulations on businesses, for safety reasons and things like that, and also, like concerns about environmental pollution. The government mandates we want to have fuel efficiency, or we want to have cars that produce less pollution and so on. And we also have like safety regulations that come from government bodies like OSHA, which specifies workers can only be in certain kinds of situations. Those are things that that Smith was even opposed to, those kind of government sort of interferences. Other countries are further along the sort of socialist spectrum. Famous examples recently, the Scandinavian countries are further along this spectrum to the left, in the sense that they have more sort of government programs that are providing people with things like housing for the homeless and stuff like that. So there's actually a whole spectrum. Now, another sort of issue on which you have like a continuum or a spectrum of possible positions to take is what I think you might call sort of social outlook. What's someone's social kind of values? How would they describe their social values? And we have those who describe their social values as sort of conservative, or maybe that they're traditionalist or something like that. They appeal to traditional values. It's difficult to define exactly what it means when someone says they're a conservative. There's sort of a bundling of ideas there, which we'll get to in a minute. But I think if you just think about the meaning of the word itself, what does conservative mean as an English word? It has something to do with being kind of old-fashioned or opposed to change or risk. And this is often opposed with being liberal. I don't think that makes a lot of sense, because the term liberal either comes from an earlier type of philosopher who was concerned with freedom, or else it comes from a more recent political party, and neither of those things seems necessarily like a good opposite of conservative. So if someone was like maybe a progressive, that makes more sense as being opposed to conservative. And then there are degrees of being progressive. If someone's a reformist, or maybe could even be described as a radical, or even like revolutionary, those seem like ideas that might be further along a spectrum from something considered conservative. Now, one issue about saying conservative that we should mention that what counts as conservative might be different in different places. It depends on the particular history of where you're from, in a way. Although many conservatives would deny this. They think there's sort of an overall human tradition or something. That seems doubtful. Like, I mean, if you're a conservative in China right now, that means something very different from being like a conservative in America or England, like, in particular in reference to, economics, your economic values, which we just described. A conservative prefers to go back to a more socialistic kind of system, whereas somebody who's not conservative maybe is in favor of changes. But those changes would be making it more like sort of society like you have in America or England. So one place is conservatives, basically, could be another place is progressives, and so there's this problem of like, couldn't this scale be like flipped depending on where we're talking about? Now, I mentioned that it doesn't really seem appropriate to oppose the term conservative with the term liberal, and the term liberal isn't easy to define. In doing so, we're often told that the first step is to distinguish between what's called classical liberalism and modern liberalism. Now, there is a modern liberal party. It started in England, and sometimes the term liberal party was used in the United States as well. Whereas when referring to classical liberalism, this concept is applied to a number of influential philosophers from a few hundred years ago who particularly were concerned with freedom, hence the term liberalism, but also human welfare in certain ways that could be roughly described as kind of utilitarian. And so John Stuart Mill, whom we've already studied, is considered a classical liberal, but also John Locke, who is earlier and we're looking at now. Even to some extent Hobbes, although it's a little bit strange to call him a liberal because he's a monarchist. He is concerned with issues about freedom and why we should give it up to a certain extent. And Smith, the economist that we mentioned before, considered a classical liberal. And again, it seems like the issues they have in common is that they're concerned with human freedom, that it should be that it's something to be desired, and also sort of human welfare or well-being. I don't mean welfare literally like receiving welfare from the government. Welfare as in doing well, people doing well, people experiencing good lives. And now the modern liberal party is more associated with more extensive sort of government programs intended at improving people's lives, and this really sort of in the United States was brought in a big way with Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 30s, who was trying to bring the country out of the Great Depression. So the classical liberals and the modern liberals certainly have very different views. You're talking about politicians and political thinkers from the 1900s in contrast with those from several hundred years earlier. And of course, they do have different views. However, it's not as if there's like no continuity that you can trace between them at all. It is possible to trace some continuity. Of course, I should mention that the classical liberals are very well liked among political thinkers in general. And so, everybody who has a political philosophy today, well, almost, wants to trace their kind of intellectual heritage back to the likes of John Locke and maybe to a lesser extent John Stuart Mill. So people of like various sort of social political views will claim, kind of descendancy from the classical liberals, and that includes the modern liberals. And there is some question whether they're really entitled to the name, but if you look at these quotes from classical liberals, and we start with John Locke, and then we compare them to some quotes from modern liberals, I think there is a potential to sort of trace continuity. Just going back, I'll give you a second to read this. I'm not going to read the whole thing out loud here. But you see that Locke is definitely concerned with freedom, preservation of life, liberty, and estates. And we'll see when we look at Mill in his political views that he thought that the government should not interfere with people's lives except to prevent harm to others. But on the other hand, even Locke, although he's concerned with freedom, he discusses a situation in which people are willing to hand over their freedoms, because he's saying people are willing to quit a condition in which they are very free in order to have a better life. And meanwhile, Mill, we've already seen as a utilitarian, and the only reason that he is in favor of government non-interference with people's lives and people being very free is because he thinks that will produce the greatest overall happiness, right? So if he thought that some degree of government interference would actually boost happiness, then he would have changed his mind about that. So he's also very concerned with, as he says, eliminating, the bad things in the world, improving people's lives. In fact, that was his main concern. And if we compare that with some statements from modern liberals, it's not like it's impossible to imagine a continuity here. Let's take a look at these quotes from Roosevelt and Kennedy. And so we see that, if you emphasize some of the points in here, Kennedy talking about civil rights and civil liberties, but he's also concerned with people's health, housing, and schools and jobs, so that, the government has some responsibility to try to improve people's lives. And if that means some degree of like tampering with the economic systems, then so be it. Of course, even earlier, basically introducing this idea to Americans, we have Roosevelt saying, look, we have new conditions and new problems. It does become the duty of the government to find new solutions, so that it's not just about freedom, it's about improving people's lives. So, again, although the views are different, it's not like it's impossible to see any continuity there. And so now that we've got some terminology that we've sort of covered, although I've continued to say some of these things are not easily defined in a very precise way. And we've got a number of spectrums. We've noticed that, where you have various positions between two extremes. I want to talk about the traditional left versus right dichotomy, and you have people you describe as being left-wing, people you describe as being right-wing. I'm sure you've heard this before. I don't know that you've thought through like exactly what it means and what the various categories are. We're often told that some of the terms that I've been discussing are different places on this spectrum. And, we're going to talk a little bit later about more specific definitions of these terms. So it does become kind of questionable whether you can say that these are just further to the left as you go from liberal to socialist to communist, or as you go from conservative to like more conservative to being fascist. Is it really appropriate to think of those things as just like going further along a spectrum? I think that when you talk about right-wing versus left-wing, what you really have are families of tendencies, and you have a whole bunch of different ideas or sort of ways of thinking that tend to go together. And there isn't any necessary logical connection between them. So it's interesting that they sort of tend to go together. So those we describe as being right-wing tend to be the, more conservative in the sense that they have an appeal to like what they might call traditional values or something like that. But they tend to think in terms of this narrative of a great, that there's this great tradition we're taking part in. Whereas those who we describe as more left-wing tend to talk in terms of social progress. Those who we describe as more right-wing tend to have nationalist tendencies, put our country first and so on and things like that. Whereas those we describe as left-wing tend to be more what I guess we could call internationalist, like more concerned with maybe global politics and how people are doing in other parts of the world as well as where they're from. The right wing tends to view inequality with as either deserved or appropriate, whereas the left wing is more apt to view inequality as unfair or undeserved. The right tends towards what I guess I would call political religiosity. In other words, religion plays a role in their political thinking to a greater extent, usually, than those that we describe as being left-wing, who tend to be more secular in their social political thought. They tend to not base what they think about society and politics on their religion necessarily. And that's another one like conservative, where depending on the religion, that could mean different things, right? Potentially anyway. I mean, there is the view out there that all religions are the same, but there certainly could be differences anyhow. In any case, maybe we'll come back to that. And when we describe people as right wing, it's more common that they would be against those who don't sort of conform to like normal ways of doing things, or just normal behaviors in general. Like they tend to have the view that homosexuality is wrong, and whereas those who we describe as more left-leaning tend to be more embracing or welcoming of nonconformity. And of course, there's a tendency when we describe someone as left-wing to lean towards socialist economics and right-wing to lean towards capitalist economics. And finally, there's the idea that on opposite ends of the spectrum, we have the extremes of communism and fascism. And it seems like, I mean, at the very least, we've got to say that it's not just like going further along the spectrum, it's that they combine it with totalitarianism. That seems to be what people really have in mind. And I guess a totalitarian system does kind of fit in more readily with if you have kind of extreme views. The more extreme you think things should be, I guess the more you tend to want to force people to do it. It should be mentioned again that these ideas are somewhat independent of each other. Each one is sort of like a spectrum, and I I would think of it in terms of almost like you could think of it as various like sliders, right, on a scale. Not sliders like the burgers, but you know, if you ever use an EQ, well, nobody. I used to have a physical EQ on my stereo when I was younger, but like you have digital ones now, where you have you slide the sliders along, right, and you might place the sliders in various positions. Maybe you put this slider here, and then you put this slider over here maybe, and this slider goes over here, and so on. We can imagine someone who mixes up the sliders like very much, but for some reason people tend to have their sliders all on one side or the other side, and it's not clear why that is. Although I have some theories, but they do. Now, I tried to give some rough characterization of socialism, which is over on the left side of the spectrum here, and didn't say anything about communism, but you may be familiar with the idea that it's a totalitarian version, a totalitarian attempt to implement socialism. We'll talk about other ways of defining those terms. That way is sort of, it's out there, whether it's completely accurate or not. But we didn't say anything about the other end of the spectrum, fascism. And fascism is even more difficult to try to define than any of these other political ideologies that we've been describing, or social political ones. The Nazis are history's most striking example of fascists. And they put the word socialist in their party name, but most social political thinkers today don't regard them as socialists, at least not in the usual sort of Marxist sense of socialism, where you have public ownership of the means of production, although they can be placed to the left, somewhat to the left, in terms of that spectrum between socialism and laissez-faire capitalism. They were certainly willing to intervene in the economic affairs of the country, and have government-sponsored building projects, and interfere with businesses in various ways as they saw fit. This isn't the most striking feature of the fascist sort of ideology, at least the ideology that they kind of promoted. The striking features are, one, extreme nationalism. The idea that for the Nazis, Germany comes first and ought to rule over other countries, and or literally push people out, or kill people in order to make room for the Germans to expand. And Hitler said, "Oh, we need this space for the Germans, so we need to kick these other people out." This kind of Germany and Germans are all that matters. And another striking feature of fascism is the authoritarianism, of course, and that's combined with a sort of worship of the political leaders, right? They had these special terms for leaders in Nazi Germany, the Führer and Il Duce, and was Mussolini in Italy, and they are almost worshipped as if they were gods or something. The Führer, the Hitler, is seen as this non-normal, abnormal human with leadership abilities that are almost a gift from God or something, or godlike, and he has this godlike status almost, and so that ties in with the authoritarianism, and the willingness to interfere with economic affairs, because there isn't a principle, upon which, well, our policy is that when X happens, we'll intervene, or we'll do this. The policy is whatever the Führer says it is, right? Because he's this godlike being. So it's in a way a departure from that rule of law concept, because if the Führer says today we do something totally different, then that's what we do. He's the Führer. And the third striking feature, of course, maybe the most, is their emphasis on racism and inequality among humans. Like there's the master race, and then there's the lower races and the lower groups, and even within the master race, there's the Führer and the other Nazis that are above normal people, and there's also this kind of there's an us-them mentality that they're promoting, and they're trying to bring people along that, yeah, you're part of the master race group, or you're part of the in group, like whatever it is, right? And we'll solve all the problems if we just get rid of these other people. Now, these are kind of the most striking features, and there are various other features that go along with fascism. It's actually a question. I want to raise the question of whether there's a serious political there is a political philosophy or ideology here to be discussed at all. Even one of Hitler's top ranking officials, Hermann Goering, basically admits that in the Nuremberg trials, when he was on trial for war crimes, naturally the common people don't want war, but after all, it's the leaders who determine the policy. So the leaders determine the policy, and it's always a simple matter to drag the people along. And here's the part that I find very interesting: whether it's a democracy, or a fascist dictatorship, or a parliament, or a communist dictatorship. So here he's suggesting, like, I don't care if it's communism or if it's fascism or whatever it is. The point is that we control the people. In other words, all we cared about is like we want to be in control, and we want to increase our power. And Hitler basically wanted to take over the world, and we wanted to take over the world with him. And we started by taking over Germany, and he's almost describing it like we're just a band of thugs that got together, and we want to take things over, right? And you could appeal to this ideology or that ideology. We don't really care. But I think that it makes sense when you look at the striking features of fascism that I mentioned before. None of these really constitute a serious attempt at like a social political worldview that's going to improve people's lives or do anything other than like get these guys in power. Like, I mean, using racism and inequality, like and telling people everything will be better once the minorities are gone. I mean, there's no real principle behind that sort of gives us a social political kind of organization that's going to accomplish anything really, and it seems kind of obvious, an obvious ploy to just to kind of drag people along, as Goering says, by using otherism, by saying, it's these other people that it's their fault that you have problems, and also the idea of, when you ask, well, what's the principle by which we're going to achieve a great society? How do we achieve a great society? Well, by listening to the leader who has godlike abilities to lead, right? I mean, that's not, what does the leader say we should do? The leader says you should do whatever the leader says at each moment. That isn't an explanation of, like, there is no philosophy there other than, like, do what I say and everything will be great. So I think that this is one reason why, it's notoriously difficult to describe the political ideology behind fascism, because it might not actually be one. It might just be a group of thugs saying whatever they think is going to work to try to control things and expand their influence. Okay, now, another political party that you should be familiar with, and maybe you've heard of them before already, the Libertarians. Ron Paul, who's run for president several times, probably the most well-known libertarian today. And they initially promoted their party as being neither liberal nor conservative. And we'll get to why they describe it that way in a second. Their overall view is that liberty should be maximized. In some cases, some libertarians even claim that liberty is like the only value, and everything else is just flows out of a concern for liberty, so that if you maximize liberty, that will be the best possible situation, and maybe like the only situation compatible with people's rights. So the idea behind this is that my liberty should only be interfered with if me doing what I want would interfere with your liberty, right? So like, I want to be free to come and take your stuff. Well, no, because that interferes with your liberty to do what you want with your stuff. And this is an idea they trace back to John Locke, whom we're going to read about and talk about. They often appeal to Locke's three chief values of life, liberty, and property as being the only natural rights down to which all political matters can be boiled. The purpose of government for libertarians is strictly to defend these things on behalf of its citizens, so that each person has a right to their life, their liberty, and their property, and the government should prevent others from interfering with those things, but otherwise not do anything to prevent people from doing what they want to do. And this ties in closely with their attitude towards taxation in particular, because taxation is one of the chief ways in which the government enforces its will on people, right? It takes your money away and it spends it on things that you might not have spent it on yourself. And libertarians think that can only be justified if they're working to preserve people's life, their liberty, or their property. So if the government wants to take money away from me and use it to have a police force so that people can't, come and take my life or take my stuff, then that's a legitimate use of the government authority. But if they want to tax me, take away my money and say go and do some project that helps less fortunate people, like a homeless shelter, that's not justified according to libertarians, because that's not defending anybody's life, their liberty, or property from interference from anyone else, right? Like, so homeless people may be in danger, but it's not as a result of someone else coming and taking their life. The government should only prevent, basically, to put it in slang terms, prevent people from messing with you. That's all, and not go out and actively try to help anyone. That's a famous libertarian policy that has led to some criticism that, this comic by Andy Singer puts it this way, that libertarianism is just anarchy for rich people, right? In other words, we have characters like this guy, the anarchist sort of punk here, who wants to get rid of government so that, we can all just take stuff from the rich people and, distribute it more evenly or something like that, right? So they're against government in that sense. And then libertarians say, oh, no, we're only against government. They're against government too, but only insofar as the government wants to take away their money and like use it to help people instead of like defending them from these folks who would like to come and take stuff away from them, right? So, the criticism is that it's just that libertarianism is really about people who think it's like to their advantage to only have rules that nobody can take stuff from you because they have all the stuff, right? So it's a self-interested kind of, it's self-interest described as a kind of political ideology. So now whether that's a good criticism of libertarianism or not is one issue, but there's another interesting issue that libertarians bring up in describing themselves, and that is that they want to redefine the sort of political spectrum. They think that the left versus right dichotomy is mistaken, and they want to replace it with something called the Nolan chart, named after a politician called Nolan. And the idea is that the traditional left versus right thing is only one-dimensional, and so we ought to have a two-dimensional kind of spectrum, where one dimension represents economic freedom, and then the other dimension concerns personal freedom. And they say that those who are traditionally thought of as right-wing, they want a high degree of economic freedom. In other words, they don't want the government interfering with business. But when it comes to personal freedom, they rank fairly low. They tend to be in favor of the government legislating like personal matters. So those who say, those who are right-wing tend to say like the government shouldn't mess with economic issues. They should let businesses do what they want. But they're usually in favor of laws against using drugs and things like that. Then on the other hand, those who are usually viewed as left-wing, they tend to be in favor of a lot of personal freedom. Like the government shouldn't tell people what drugs they could put in their body. The government shouldn't tell people anything about their sexual life, and so on. Nothing about their personal life. But then they do think that the government should interfere in the economic sphere, and so then they're not in favor of much kind of personal freedom economic freedom. And so they're up here in this upper left corner. The right-wingers are down here in this lower right corner. Meanwhile, the communists and the fascists are both somewhere over here where they don't favor much kind of freedom at all because they're totalitarian systems. And they say, the libertarians, we are up here in this upper right corner because we're in favor of both kinds of freedom. We want maximal economic freedom. We also want maximal personal freedom. So libertarians tend to combine being against things like the war on drugs and legislating what people can what sort of sexual relationships people can have and anything of that nature relating to your personal life. And they're also against government interference with business. They also believe, along with like Adam Smith, that businesses should be allowed to do whatever they want and let the free market like just sort of work itself out, and that will work out for the best. And notice that if you rotate this kind of two-dimensional graph like 45 degrees, you can put the left wings, the left wing on the left and the right wing on the right, just like in the traditional left versus right kind of spectrum. And the libertarians are up here at the top, right, being in favor of a lot of, notice this corresponds to the axes over here, right? So the libertarians in favor of both kinds of freedom. Authoritarians, including communists and fascists, are down here. They don't have much freedom. They're not in favor of much freedom of any kind. And then those on the left are in favor of one kind of freedom. Those on the right in favor of the other kind of freedom, but only one kind. The libertarians describe themselves as being sort of in favor of all kinds of freedom, unlike the left-wingers and the right-wingers. Now, when you look at this sort of chart, it kind of makes sense that any totalitarian system is equivalent in terms of where it falls on this chart. Whether it's communist or whether it's fascist, if it's like totalitarian, the more totalitarian it is, the more it falls sort of into this lower left corner here, or the more it falls into on the sort of bottom of this scale over here. I mean, I would point out that the reason for that is because this scale is designed to be strictly just about freedom. So yeah, if you have a totalitarian dictatorship of any kind, no matter what its ideology is, it's not very free. So that it's going to fall down here. But there may be other kinds of differences between these different totalitarian systems. Indeed, other kinds of differences between different libertarians or different right-wingers, different left-wingers, than just these two issues of how free are people? How free are people economically, and how free are people, non-economically in other terms? And this is why when I talked about the left wing versus right wing, I brought up that it's really a family of kind of spectrums, and that always tend to kind of slide one way or the other together. but that aren't it's not necessary that they do so. So really, in terms of economic freedom and personal freedom, you could put those on the left versus right spectrum as well. But the criticism that the left versus right spectrum is one-dimensional is kind of mistaken, because as I mentioned when talking about this left wing versus right wing, it isn't actually just one issue in terms of which we're categorizing someone as left versus right. It's actually all these different issues, but it's just that in one sense, as I said, these are like sliders, and we can sort of describe. It's possible to have people that combine all kinds of different points on these different sliders, but they tend to kind of slide together. So it's not necessarily that there's only one dimension involved in the left versus right thing. And I would point out that it makes sense to think of communism and fascism as having a lot in common if you're only thinking in terms of the Nolan chart, because it strictly focuses on the issue of how economically free you are. The other issue is how personally free you are. But what about all these other issues that I think do have an impact on, the political ideology? Right? I mean, whether you're thinking in terms of social progress being important, or whether you're thinking in terms of having traditional values being important, that's going to have an impact on what sort of policies you instantiate. And it's not necessarily just reducible to, economic freedom versus personal freedom. The same thing with questions about nationalism versus internationalism. That's not necessarily just an issue of how free should people be in one way versus another way. So that if you have internationalist tendencies, but you also think people should be very free in both ways, that's going to be different from being nationalistic and having that same view. So that really, I mean, if the Nolan chart's fine, but there's nothing wrong with thinking of it in terms of two different spectrums that we can compare. One of them's already on here on the left versus right idea, and then the other one we could just include in here too. I think it's somewhat included in some of these ideas already, like the nonconformity versus conformity issue. So there is the Nolan chart, really those arguing that the left versus right is an oversimplification. They may be oversimplifying it, because it doesn't just mean one kind of spectrum. It's actually a whole bunch of different things. And it's interesting that this also accentuates features that are different between, say, totalitarian fascism and totalitarian communism. So that issue is sort of related to the whole debate over whether we ought to consider the fascists socialists or not, and whether if you go all the way to the left or if you go all the way to the right, does that end up being the same thing? Of course, by definition, with regard to freedom, if you're talking about totalitarian systems, then they're going to be pretty similar with regard to freedom. But there are these other issues that have a lot to do with what sort of political goals you're aiming at, that I think might make a big difference in sort of what sort of society you end up with. So that's certainly far from like a complete discussion of that whole issue, which would actually take its own video. And now, just to review all the various different social political issues and categories and spectrums that I've sort of gone over here. We dealt with questions about human nature, and whether we're basically nasty, greedy creatures, or whether we're basically noble, and how society sort of influences that. And then we talked about power structures, various power structures, essentially the main ones being either democracy, majority control, or oligarchy, some form of minority control. Economic systems and sort of policies ranging from complete socialists to laissez-faire capitalists, social outlook, ranging from conservative to progressive, and or even like radical or revolutionary in terms of some, I guess, social outlook would be a way to categorize that. We talked about forms of liberalism and the various meanings that that term can have. The left versus right dichotomy and the family of spectrums that's really involved in categorizing something as left wing versus right wing as a sort of oversimplification. Where fascism fits into the set of into the vocabulary here, as well as the libertarian take on things, and the Nolan chart as either an addition to, as I suggested, or as they suggest sometimes, a replacement for the left versus right dichotomy. So keeping all that stuff in mind, I think as we go through some more specific social political philosophy, it might help to sort of gauge things and categorize things in order to understand them better. And indeed, not just for the political philosophy that we're going to look at, but anytime you're looking at someone's social political values, or their kind of ideology, or what they seem to believe about it, here are a bunch of kind of issues and categories in which you can think.